So thank you, everyone. It's really great to be here. Coming to you, I just want to acknowledge I'm coming from Kaurna land, which is Adelaide, not in Melbourne, that's where I used to live, but in Australia, and just pay respects to elders, past and present, and extend any acknowledgement and respects to First Nations people here today. So my presentation is Listening in Times of Crisis, IDOCs as Models for Listening Across Difference. I think my talk's a little bit more conceptual because I really want to use this to test out some ideas for a book I'm writing about different modalities of listening in IDOCs in relationship to crises. So how can these documentary projects enlarge our capacity and facilitate a listening across difference? And how does it focus on the gaps, multiplicity, incompleteness, conflict, invite the audience to listen in different ways and implicate them in a responsibility? And because I've been reading Jill Godmiller's new book, which I'd recommend lately, I'm thinking about how to avoid the pornography of the real, or also in homage to Brian Winston, who recently passed away, the tradition of the victim. And yes, my lineage is obviously quite firmly in documentary studies and practice. So just to briefly touch on how we can talk about listening, because it often comes up, and a few people have mentioned listening today. I'm interested in the many different fields which listening intersect. So political theory, communication, media, sociology, sound studies, philosophy, art, and activism. So my interest really is around political theory and listening, drawing on Chantal Mouffe's idea of a democracy as a plurality of differences, or Jacques Rancier's notion of democracy as a fluid space for participatory encounters. So I also draw a link between the work that I'm interested in and my research, and Kate Nash's connection between interactive documentary, democracy, and civic participation. So just in terms of thinking about how we can think about listening across difference in IDOCs, I'm interested in the ideas around listening to dissonance and the limits of polyphony, listening as solidarity, listening to destabilize, and listening to decolonize, and the other than human. So I just want to start first with this idea about listening as or to dissonance. So in direct response to political division in the US and an increasing awareness of the tribalism of politics, filter bubbles and echo chambers, Halsey Burgan's Radio Left-Right is the most immediate example of an attempt to map the spectrum of different political perspectives using the organized principle of a map and an interface that allows user-generated content where participants can express their concerns about the political landscape. So listening in on these contributions, there's a clear desire from the participants to hear perspectives that are outside their own bubble. I really like the intention of this work as it invites a listening to the dissonance that is democracy. And on the sort of the landing page here, Burgan writes, under the mutual respect banner, "You will hear things you don't agree with and that might even offend you. But please don't give up. This is the point. Listen with an open mind and heart and give to others the same respect you desire from them." So this intention calls to mind Simone Weil's concept of valuing a whole person, not just their personality, opinions, or body. She writes, "It is he, the whole of him, the arms, the eyes, thoughts, everything." But as an open source, user-generated interactive documentary project, it naturally attracts a certain kind of participation. And I wonder what is possible in documentary. Can we hear these voices unmediated and filtered through an authorial framing? So is it possible to listen to opinions and voices that are very different without some kind of mediation? Can documentary really hold a space for such disparate views? Should we expect it to? What are the limits to polyphony? Is everyone included? How do we hear the unsympathetically different? So I'll just leave that for a moment as I turn to a more familiar act of listening across difference in documentary as a collective act of solidarity. And here I'm interested in works.
Yeah. Just to let you know, you're not screen sharing, but it doesn't really matter.
Oh, aren't I?
No, but I mean, you're still very engaging. We're just maybe missing some of the references.
Oh my God, how terrible.
Well, no, but we're listening. You're encouraging us to listen, so it's fine.
Oh yeah, I know.
Sharing now.
All right. I'm sure you're familiar with this work anyway. So just moving on to the next one, listening as solidarity. So in The Force of Listening, Faranetti and Firth discussed activist art practices that involve collective listening in what they suggest has roots in feminist consciousness raising groups of the 1960s. Here, women would gather and share their experiences, with speaking and listening equally important. In the absence of the participant of documentary, how might collective acts of listening be mobilized as a practice of listening together, listening as solidarity? I know that other works like Kipu have been revolutionary in creating a feedback loop that acknowledge that the stories of the participants have been heard. This is another project called by the Manus Recording Project Collective. In How Are You Today, by the Manus Recording Project Collective, refugees in offshore detention in Nauru and Manus Island recorded 10-minute daily audio diaries about what they saw, where they were, how they felt. In 2018, as part of Liquid Architecture's Ear Witnessing exhibition in Melbourne, an audience of listeners gathered in a room to hear these scratchy recordings made on smuggled phones. Yes, the seats were hard and the recordings were difficult to hear and sometimes boring, but listening with others made us feel more implicated in the cruel government's regime. This is what listening can do, the power of listening together. When these refugees were brought to Australia at the beginning of 2020 and kept in detention in dank hotels, the recordings continued and were distributed to listeners as text messages. These are now available on a platform that gives information about where they are since being released a few months ago. Listening to destabilize. Listening in IDOCs can also destabilize a firm understanding of the experience of another. For can we really ever understand another? To reference Trinity Minhar, it is as though listening nearby. In How to Tell a True Immigrant Story, the filmmaker Aggie Bazaz uses strategies that resist representation, familiarization, and narrative closure to destabilize the audience's expectations that they can ever understand the experience of an immigrant, or that there actually is a true immigrant story. Through a range of audio and visual strategies, the responsibility is placed on the audience. Here, documentary is not to look at another, but where the viewer must look at themselves. And then finally, just to listening to decolonize and listening to the other than human. And by this, I mean, not in terms of colonial subjugation, but shifting to a non-dominant position. Listening with the assistance of technology can enable other voices to be heard. Here in Liz Miller's Swampscapes, the participant can create their own symphony by selecting these elements of the ecosystem, including frogs, birds, alligators, and rain. Training the ear towards the other than human. So just in conclusion, I just want to return to some of the questions that I had in the beginning, just about what can listening do and to what extent should we hear and can we hear other voices? Can documentary really hold a space for disparate views and should we expect it to, or is that for something else altogether, a different form, a different medium? And what are the limits to polyphony and is everyone included in that? And how do we listen to the unsympathetically different? And that's all.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I think some resonances with our discussion before about having about not having to have about not needing to have agreement as a premise for a shared world, but how do we listen to people who are coming from a very different point of view without closing down that kind of distinction between your world, my world. Yeah, really fascinating. Thank you.
Making sure I have the right screen. Wait. You should see not that, but this. Are you seeing a big word that says exposed?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, good. Then we're in the right place, I think. All right. So hello, hi, I'm Sharon Daniel. I'm coming to you from California, where it is still very early in the morning. I'll do my best. I've been caffeinating for a while now. So Exposed documents the spread of COVID-19 in prisons, jails, and detention centers over time from the perspective of incarcerated people. I conceived of this project during the early period of sheltering in place. I had no idea how long the pandemic would last or how bad it would get, but I knew that however the pandemic might unfold, it would be far worse for incarcerated people. Prisons and jails are incubators and amplifiers of infectious diseases where social distancing and basic sanitation are impossible. The first confirmed case of COVID-19 infection among prisoners in the US was reported at the Federal Bureau of Prisons on March 21st, 2020. By early April that year, I was spending hours every day scouring the news for information about the spread of the virus inside prisons and jails. While mainstream media and local news stations were reporting on the issue, only niche and specialist publications that were focused on criminal justice reform were providing consistent coverage and collecting data at that time. I decided that it was important, to me at least, to find a way to start documenting the spread of the virus in prisons, specifically from the perspective of prisoners and their families. I normally develop my projects from original interviews conducted over months or usually even years of field work. But after the first reported coronavirus infection in the US, incarcerated people were subjected to extreme forms of isolation. Visits were suspended, phone privileges restricted, and the use of solitary confinement expanded by orders of magnitude. So I decided to collect all the quotes and statistics I could find from news sources online and then assemble them into an interactive timeline to create a multivocal cumulative public record and evolving history of the pandemic's impact on people in prisons and jails across the US. I believe it takes more than one story to represent structural racism and state violence. So all of my work is multivocal. And in some way, I feel that even this work of quotation is co-created with those whose perspectives were brought here together to represent both their own particular and individual experience and the collective and shared experience of incarcerated people during the pandemic. The timeline began on March 3rd, 2020, and the project launched on October 30th, 2020. I updated it weekly until December 31st, 2021, with sometimes more than 100 entries in the database for a single day. I wanted the scope and scale of the project to reflect the scope and scale of the crisis in an emerging dialogic polyphony. The monochrome, imageless, headline-style interface is designed to visualize the collective suffering of incarcerated people and signal that the injustices they endure are structural. Now I'm going to play a very short screen capture taken during the time of the first major outbreak at San Quentin State Prison in California. Hopefully this actually works.
Well, in terms of 300, I'm not surprised to hear that. Although I do feel that those numbers are low and probably underreported. In fact, I heard one of the medical staff tell someone this morning that anyone who is sick or having symptoms, there's nothing that they can do. They're just going to leave people inside the cells or wherever they're housed at. And the only time that they're going to move anyone or give them some type of medical treatment is if they're having respiratory problems to the point where they can't breathe. Yeah, I wish I had better news to report, but at this point, it just doesn't look good. It doesn't look good. The virus is spreading through here like wildfire, so I imagine whatever's going on in this unit is going on in every other unit.
Even before COVID, the criminal punishment system in the US was based on the concept of quarantine. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the US, the practice of quarantine as we know it began during the 14th century, an effort to protect coastal cities from plague epidemics. In the mid-20th century, Americans invented a criminal punishment system based on the model of quarantine to protect white privilege and power against advances in civil rights and the end of Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation. Laws that essentially criminalized the lives of poor people and people of color were rapidly enacted, catalyzing a massive increase in the level of incarceration. The disproportionately poor Black or brown offender was to be treated as a pathogen, to be isolated and contained. COVID-19, an actual pathogen, both exposed and intensified the brutality of this quarantine punishment system. Much has been written about how the prison exemplifies Foucault's concept of heterotopias of deviation. The pandemic crisis produced a state of exception, a quarantine within a quarantine, in which the heterotopia of crisis, which for Foucault had been replaced in modern societies by the heterotopia of deviation, reemerges within the prison. Since the start of the pandemic, prisons and ICE detention centers across the US have reported at least 600,383 total cumulative cases among incarcerated people and 3,100 total cumulative deaths among incarcerated people. In late April 2020, a prisoner at Marion Correctional Institution in Ohio, which at that time was the largest coronavirus hotspot in the US, wrote the following. Foucault says the last trait of heterotopias is that they have a function in relation to all the space that remains. The function of the prison system has been to sequester, to erase, to quarantine, a space where a prisoner's life becomes what Giorgio Agamben calls bare life, reduced to an existence that can be ignored, neglected, or extinguished with impunity, precisely because it is the law that renders it expendable. But the virus moved between this heterotopia and all the other spaces that remain, demonstrating that the prison system itself constitutes a public health crisis that must not be ignored. Exposed stands as a public record of testimony to this fact. And I missed the instruction about having a question for the audience. So I don't have one off the top of my head, but hopefully I'll get a question that will stimulate another question. Thank you so much for your attention.
That's great. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I mean, there's no need to have a question. It's more of a kind of suggestion that if people wanted to post something to the audience, they were very welcome to. So feel free to think one up, or no pressure if you don't want to. But yeah, thank you. That was brilliant. So yeah, last but not least, we'll have Sandra. Great to
Hey
hear from you.
everybody, hello from London. Don't know if it's a good deal to be the last one. Let's see if you can bear with me. Okay, so first, let's see if you can share. Oh, everything has disappeared. That's interesting. Hang on 1 second. It disappeared in the wrong screen. Okay. What can you see? Can you see a full screen?
Yeah,
or can you
we
see my
your
notes?
screen. I could see your slide with the eye and the title.
Okay, so there is no notes.
No,
right,
no.
we've escaped that issue so far. Excellent. Okay, so last but not least, I just wanted to actually speak about a project that again was very much linked to the Corona crisis. So I think that really fits into our panel today. And the project is called Corona Haikus, and quite a few people actually who are in our group today have participated to this project. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview, because for those who don't know about it, this is a project that I'm personally involved with, because I was co-creator, but also a participator to the project by, creating visual poetry. That happened just during the lockdown, pretty much during 10 weeks. And what I'm sharing today, I would like to share some totally informed reflections on how the project seems to have had a sort of very strong individual impact, but also a community impact, which is the thing that really has started make me think about how could that happen? What is it that worked, and what do we have to learn from it? So this is a reflection that I haven't started alone. It's been a lot of discussion going on, and just to let you know, we have co-written a paper, again, something that we did as a collaborative effort. A paper with Anna Whale, which is here, and also Jasmine Kermanchi, which is also here today. And this is a paper where we started thinking about how was this project designed, and what are the actions that allowed it to have an impact. And the paper is called Co-Creation as Immediated Caring and Sharing in Times of Crisis. And this is a reflection that I'm trying to go beyond what we wrote, and also I'll be sharing more in another conference in about a month's time on the 10th of June at the IFM, which is the Interactive Film and Media Conference. But here really in 10 minutes, I can't really go through the whole thing. So I thought I'll just chat and see whether it makes sense to you. So Corona Haiku project, it started as a Facebook project. It was a Facebook group that I initiated with my friend Sandra Tavares Duque from Colombia. This started on the 1st of April 2020, pretty much the first day of lockdown in the UK. And the reason was completely personal, is that, we were organizing an IDOCS conference that we had to cancel. I had a lot of things planned with Sandra Tavares that we had to cancel. And we just got, very frustrated and very lonely and very upset. And we thought, okay, we have to find a way to be together. And in touch with the community that we're not going to see. And so we created what seemed the easiest thing to do, which was a Facebook group, because as we were all stuck at home, people were on Facebook at that moment. And it's a project that is still continuing, but I will only speak about its first phase, where that lasted the whole of the lockdown pretty much, so 10 weeks. And over 10 weeks of lockdown, we probably had around 1,000 people collaborating and creating visual poetry together. And they came pretty much from, all around the world. We had 31 countries represented. So I'm just going to zoom into the first post that happened to be mine, because I initiated the project. But to explain, the intention was very easy call to action, 3 photos, 1 text. We called it visual poetry, but really the intent was to find a creative way to document our being in isolation, and actually also to use our phones to look differently, to look at details, and to, in a way, be more mindful of what we were going through. So that was the idea of the project. That's how it started. But what really, really surprised me was that as we started, so I'm just sharing here a series of anonymized comments that were posted or that we received as we started the project. And I'm not going to read through them, but what was clear is that people seemed to really feel that this was a way to be more mindful, that they felt that this was a collective project, so they were feeling part of a collective. That sharing experiences seemed to have an effect on them. And it was, in a way, lifting spirits, some people said, and some others said, actually, it's a project that really lifts my heart. So that there was a connection between sharing and emotions. And once the project was finished, so this is after we closed the first lockdown, I kept receiving emails, personal posts. Sometimes it was on Facebook. And again, even after 10 weeks, overall, what I was receiving was, this opened the doors to our creativity, and it allows us to feel a bond with everybody, but also a feeling of, by sharing and by being, we create hope. There was a lot of gratefulness. People felt accompanied, held. And overall, basically, this has really surprised me. And therefore, from there onward, I'm here with this question: what is it that has touched people so much? So, of course, we were in a state of shock. That was a moment of crisis. Of course, this is bonding people by definition when you're in shock and you need to be together. But people connected with people that they had never seen in their life. And they ended up actually sharing, fairly intimate feelings, which for me was very surprising. And so this is really what I'm trying to understand a little bit better. And in the article that I mentioned before, the state of thinking with Anna and Jasmine was to think, okay, maybe what happened is that we created like 3 levels of action. So I'm sharing here just one haiku from Valentine Godard, who is saying, stop and close your eyes. And in a way, the first personal level of action that we created was very personal, and so has a personal impact, which was about stopping, feeling, and connecting. And we thought of it like an act of self-care in a certain way. So this is another haiku that expressed similar feelings of the fact of stopping and being able to connect is already a moment of, impersonal impact and detachment from the reality that hurts, or connection to it, maybe. The second level that we thought maybe we had created was that by sharing, you then go out of your own private sphere and connection with yourself, and you move publicly. And so going public in a way is an act of self-empowerment, because you find a voice and you dare being in front of others. And that creates a third level of impact in a way that is more of a community level. That's when you move at a community level where by commenting, by speaking, commenting to others and holding other points of views, there is an act of community care. So this is pretty much where I was, and I'm just sharing a couple more of the comments that were to show a little bit the dynamics. But the important thing to me is that none of this was planned. It's not that this project was created thinking strategically, oh, we're going to do 3 phases and we will have 3 levels of impact. It happened to become. And this is now shifting me into thinking, okay, so what is it that was triggered and how was it used? And now this is bringing me at this moment to a reflection which is more and more about agency in iDocs and designing agency for impact. So, when we speak about agency, most of the time, or very often, we recur to these, well-known definitions from Janet Murray, which is about the satisfying power to take meaningful actions and to see the result of our decisions and choices. And what it means to me is that agency is very much defined as power. So it's a power that a designer or an author gives to an interactor or users. And it needs to feel meaningful, but what is meaningful is the action, is the moment of action. And the action most of the time is understood as an action that is within the story. On an iDocs, on a WebDoc, we click within the story to see the next part of the story. So this action is confined within the story. And when I'm thinking about this definition, I'm trying to apply to the Corona Haiku project and how we use agency. So the definitions is still the same points. And I'm thinking, okay, what happened in our case? Because the power was more than one. You know, those three phases, which each of those actually meant a lot of micro shifts and micro agencies. I would say that overall, there is a whole series of agencies that have allowed meaningful actions for sure when you share and when you comment, but for sure also meaningful feelings. So it's not only about acting, it's also about connecting within. And instead of just having decisions within the story, when you create and you're doing something participatory, you actually have another level. And this for me means that your feeling, action, and reflections do not always need to be within the story, but can be within a private space. And this private space belongs only to you, really. So it brings me to, and I'm concluding with that, to the idea that we might want to think differently of agency, or at least give it much more depth and complexity. And I'm starting to think about what is, for example, reflexive agency as I have the power within myself to see things differently, or to connect to myself differently because of that iDocs. But maybe that's never going to be shared. And if I share it, then it becomes part of a strategy of agency that therefore is evolutive, in the sense that each step grows into each other and creates a whole that is systemic. So I want to start thinking about designing for agency for impact as systemic, where each bit is like, has a purpose and opens and empowers to enter into the next part of potentiality and change and transformation. So this is where I am now, and there will be more at the IFM conference. And I'm just leaving you with the last fairly positive haiku that was shared, and that will be it for me. Thank you. And I'm stop sharing it. There we go.
Brilliant, thank you. That was a really interesting and ambitious proposition at the end, which sounds fascinating. I think had really interesting connections to some of the previous talks as well. I don't know if anybody's got any immediate questions. If not, I've got some thoughts I'd love to share. But thank you to you all for a great round of presentations. It's not easy to finish up after a long day of listening, and but we've managed to keep the caliber of intellectual discussion very high, so that's brilliant. Can we see any hands up at the moment? Mike?
Well, I'll chip in, because I think there's a parallel here with the sorts of thing I was mentioning about onward journey and empowerment, that is here in this project. Is, I mean, I personally, when lockdown happened and my partner needed to stay isolated, we kind of broke the isolation by going out really early in the morning every day. And within a few days, I got my nice camera out and just started posting photographs. So I can see exactly the same motivation coming through here, except as a collective experience. And I think the thing that I found, and I can see reflected in these projects, is doing something useful, not necessarily useful and impactful in a positive fashion, not necessarily on the environment or whatever, as we were talking about earlier, but on each other's mental environment. And I think that what you've got here is something that is almost an onward journey that has already started moving onwards, and is being moved onwards by the collective, by the audience and actors together. It's certainly something that fits with the next piece of investigation we want to do, which is audience participation in media generally, and go back through our research. But this puts another perspective on that, as in sort of collaborative endeavour with a positive outcome. I think it's a really lovely piece to see.
Thank you, Michael. I just want to add to that. I mean, this is exactly what I'm starting to think about, this idea of, sort of the space of action does not need to be the story that is shared, but can also be a psychological space and inward space. But this step is compulsory if you then want to do something meaningful collaboratively. So they're not detached. They are completely linked, because it's only because you were touched yourself that you can actually then first be empathic to others, or wanting to share, or that the fact of sharing becomes meaningful to you. So this is why I was thinking about this idea of evolutive agency, in the sense that it's not first I do this and then that. No, this is like a very complex mesh that allows us to open up and eventually to have impact, transformation, or or holding within a community. So how can we think and design differently the agencies when we create an IDOC is really what at the moment is in my mind. Not that I have the solution, by the way.
Thank you. Who has a question? I think I saw a second hand up. Was it Daniel and then Anna?
Yeah, thank you. I had a quick question for Sharon. Okay, so the question is about the aesthetics of the piece, and what I found interesting is that one association I was making with the way that you use text in the piece was like Soviet era agitprop, like the intertitles that you'll see in like a Dziga Vertov film, for instance. But then you don't see the rest. So I don't know if you had those sorts of associations in mind, but in a sense, you subtract the image from that intertitle, right? It's missing. There is no image. So there seems to be a cinematic metaphor, but then the cinema is removed or subtracted or unexposed, and you're just sort of left with this intertitle or this piece of cinematic technology or the empty space of the cinema. And then the other element that, and then maybe that also looks like something more contemporary, like closed captioning or something like that. One might get a sense of like when you're listening to the audio recording that you have brackets around the text in that instance. So anyway, I'm reminded more of like an intertitle or a subtitle in that instance. And then in terms of the audio, there's it sounds a little bit like a tuning fork or maybe some medical instrument, that little buzzing or ringing noise that you hear in the background. And then I know the piece, I've seen the piece, other parts of the piece where I think you hear the sound of something that sounds a bit more like the closing of a steel prison door or something like that, which maybe is a similar sound in some ways to this ringing noise that you hear. But maybe that ringing could also be cinematic, like an audio recording instrument that's being tuned, a piece of technology, in other words. So in short, could you speak to maybe how technology is represented in the film and how maybe cinema is or is not represented in the piece in relation to the human, right? The individual or the human?
Oh, thanks. That's a really interesting question. I have to say, I don't think I was thinking about cinema at all in the design of the piece. I think when you see it in I'm glad you've looked at it online, because the device of the text as sort of intertitles functions around the way that the work is interactive. So for people who haven't looked at it online, you click or use your arrow key to step through the different screen views of each quote. So statistics are a single screen view, quotes are multiple screen views, and then the audio is a single screen view. The idea being that I wanted the viewer to sort of actively read the quote and be moving through it at their own pace. So showing it like this is a little bit, you know, kind of not true to the form of the work. The words were all we had. There is no imagery accompanying any of the text, because most of the quotes come from actual text, come from reportage online. I wanted there to be a kind of space in which to experience the work. So the text was, the stepping through of the text is broken up using sort of a combination of an algorithm and a kind of natural language processing algorithm and some tokenization, and then just some hard, you know, like actually deciding where the text is going to be broken up in some cases. And the sound is, there's actually a number of different sounds. There's a whole database of sounds, and the sounds are sort of mixed algorithmically, so you shouldn't actually hear the same sound track in different experiences of the work. And the idea behind that was to create an immersive environment for you to move through the texts, rather than just a reading, a sort of sense of being in a space, and that space is this kind of other space, the inside space of the carceral systems that are represented through the speech of the incarcerated people, also advocates and family members. So yeah, I'm not sure that really answered your question, because I wasn't actually thinking about cinema at all. It's a really interesting idea that you pose in that question, and I will think about it more, but it was more a set of design choices around some pretty radical constraints in terms of where the data comes from. So there's a massive amount of data. There are over 11,000 data entries in the database now, that the project is closed out, and a very simple and straightforward way of visualizing them all in a way equally. I hope that answers the question. Thanks.
Thank you. I think Anna had a question as well.
My question goes to all four panelists, and it is about agency, resilience, and what connects these two to the multi-perspective and the crisis, as well as the interactive, which Bharat brings into the discussion. Because really what reminded me what Sandra was saying about these micro agencies and the shift on the first level of this onion of interactivity that took place, or interactivity in this case, then that reminded me of Bharat a lot, and this post-humanist thinking. Would you see any parallels between this, and which role does listening then play?
Sorry, Anna, who are you calling into this discussion?
I think
all four of you, I'd love to hear, because it resonates with almost all of the presentations.
I think you have to formulate it differently so that we can chip in. Could that be? I mean, I think at the moment you're linking bits, but it's like, okay, where can we bring it? What is the bit where you think we can bring it?
Maybe let's take the agency as a point of departure, and what really agency means in these projects related to crisis, because we don't want to die in crisis, or to just say, okay, crisis is here, but how can we deal with this in agentic ways?
So I just share, my humble opinion, which is only related to the Corona Haiku project, because this is what I'm sharing today. But I kept the idea of agency. Of course, we have agency as human being in life. And the thing for me that is important is that when we're speaking of agency within interactive narrative, we're talking about a much more limited agency, which is the one that is given to you by, let's say, the author or the interactive architecture of the piece. And that's how we see it. And so the problem is, okay, so what can you do? What is made possible to you as a user or participant? And what does this doing do to you, so that then your agency in your own life, which is another step, and that is outside of this, the interactive iDocs, has actually moved, some sort of change and therefore impact, not just within the iDoc, but within the real world, or let's call it like that. So this is where I was trying to create this reflection. And somehow, in a very simplistic way, for me, it's like, actually, change always has to be initiated within somehow. And so, if we start to think about designing for agencies which are not just about browsing within a story, which somehow, of course, part of us is engaged within a story, but we are active within a field which is not ourselves. Can we start thinking about designing experiences that where the agency, so the doing, is within ourselves? And then we can do something with it and share it or create something together. But if that internal shift has not happened within, I see it a bit difficult to really make an impactful change in the world. So this is a very simplistic way of putting it in a way, but that's what I was trying to answer to.
I just think, sorry, I just wanted to add to that. I was just really interested in what you were saying, Sandra, just about the kind of, I guess, sort of the systemic change through the collective action and sort of building a community of action in a small scale way that may lead to some kind of other project that has more sort of an external systemic change. And I was just thinking that in terms of like my really big question about whether it's possible to kind of have a kind of polyphony of really disparate, dissonant voices. So I think there was a really...
I think it's completely possible. And actually this maybe will go and answer more to Florian. So I'm starting to putting dots together. So it's like, can we ever, step out of ourselves, be more plural and accepting other point of views? Can we ever? I think we can. I mean, potentially everybody can. Some people are more drawn to that than others by education, by sensitivity, whatever. But overall, as Anna was saying as well, we are multiple. We are, an assemblage of body, mind, emotions. So it is there. The question is, how do we, get acquainted to it and use this as a state of that is not dangerous, and if anything, it's a state that opens up to the world. So my answer to you is, I think that if we can use iDocs to be acquainted to our own multiplicity, then we are suddenly much more able to listen to the others and to collaborate with others and to do stories which are, much more complex, and accept that this complexity is messy. It's not a one story. It doesn't have a beginning, doesn't have an end. It is messy, but it's about not being scared of the messiness. That's where I stand.
I think that's fascinating. I think it links really nicely to the question that Brett was asking as well about how these kind of media projects can face larger challenges. And I was thinking when Brett was speaking about how that mechanism of changing individual behaviour is a way of facing larger challenges, because as you're saying really nicely, Sandra, you have to kind of rewire your own brain and reorientate yourself within the world to be part of that wider systemic change. So I think there's a really interesting commonality emerging here across these projects about iDocs as a tool for kind of changing the way that we as individuals think in order to act better within a collective. But Judith, do you want to come in there as well?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I just thought I might just add a little bit on intra-action, because it might not be something that people have heard of. So this comes out of theoretical physics. So Karen Barad was a physicist, but Tim Ingold, and he talks about something similar in anthropology. He talks about meshworks rather than networks. So intra-action is designed as a sort of just a provocation around what we mean by interaction and intra-action. So Karen says interaction is when you think of yourself as a solid state. So I'm a human being and I'm a fixed entity, and I interact with another human being that's a solid state and a fixed entity, or I interact with another object that's a fixed entity. Whereas intra-action, which is adding this extra element that actually says, actually, I'm not a fixed entity. And when I interact with another person, they're not a fixed entity. So there's more scope for an actual, I was going to say a fluid exchange. That sounds, you know, not necessarily literal, but a sense of fluidity between that by engaging with another person, or even engaging with nature, even engaging with, I don't know, when you go swimming in the sea, that there's actually there's a dynamic fluid exchange going on between things. I'll put in the chat, there's a book called The Third Policeman by Flann O'Brien, and for me it's just a really easy way to explain it. It's a kind of surreal comedy, but there's a policeman who rides his bicycle all the time in an Irish village. Anne-Marie probably knows this book, and he rides it so much that Flann O'Brien says that actually he and the bicycle have become one. And he's got to a point that if he's not on his bicycle, he's not got any balance, because the bicycle and him are so sort of locked together. And that's that kind of idea of intra-action, where spending so much time on a bicycle has changed him. So that, I thought that might be helpful. And then I just bringing back to the polyphonic documentary project, because the idea there, and this idea of transformation, and Sandra, there was a lovely quote in one of the haikus she shared, or comments on the haikus, that, you know, this is not a normal, the pandemic wasn't a normal situation. It should, and it should change us. This is time for a reset. And Patty Zimmerman's always talking about it's time for a reset, and people saying the normality has been challenged and we want to get back to normal. But then there's all the theories that actually normality before the pandemic was already pretty messed up. As Sharon says, when she's talking about prisons, quarantine already existed, you know, and this was just an intensification of that. But that was already, you know, it was already there. So questioning the normal that, you know, people say, oh, let's get back to normal, or thinking of this as a moment for thinking about how the transformations we need to make. So the polyphonic documentary project is there's a group of us that are all interested, you know, and people are welcome to join, but people who are interested in these ideas as a way of collectively collaborating and, you know, sharing media, sharing ideas and looking at the tools. And in a way, the first stage of that isn't really meant for an external audience necessarily. It's meant for ourselves to kind of share and think about how we might go about doing this. And then maybe the experiences that we learn, then people involved in that project also have their own projects. So then we have the discussion about how we make pieces of media that we've worked collectively together on, but then also how that could impact in our thinking about our own projects, perhaps where we're thinking about wider impact and audiences. And like Sharon's work, which, you know, would be great if more people knew about what her project literally exposes. So there's the layers, aren't there? Layers of collaboration, layers of individual and collective sharing, and that work to different agendas, yes, at different times. So yeah, that's just some thoughts, really. But maybe you understand intra-action now.